yet, knowing about all of that, knowing about the Mexican-American War and how America just stole, and I think it's a well-known fact, almost half of Mexico's territory, because it was weak, because they just become independent from Spain, and they didn't have the power to defend itself, or that large territory that they had for themselves all of a sudden. They stole Texas and California and part of New Mexico and so on. And now the Mexicans who come into those territories that were their own, their ancestral homes, now they're illegal and they're criminals. And yet, that territory was taken away by a criminal act of this nation. I understand all that. I get all that. I get the treatment of blacks and of Latinos and so on and so forth. And yet, having seen all of that, I think when people speak of a great America, and I believe with you the same thing, it's very simplistic. I think they're talking about the America of the Second World War, the America that stood up to Nazism, and that by the viewpoint of their own Europeans, it was a saving intervention. The America of the Marshall Plan, the rebuilding of Europe, that great generation, of the Second World War. The America that was seen as a moral example. The America that was an inspiration to many. The America that opened its doors to immigration. The America that was seen as the option of last resort and a first resort at times, keeping the world in some sort of order, while even being because all nations are selfish. It is the nature of the fall, is the nature of sinfulness. All natures are unjust, and that's where the church needs to be that enlightening influence, continually criticizing things from that perspective of, the Christ and of the scriptures. But I think that sometimes we do a disservice to the complexity of things by just saying, well, you look at all the things that America has done that are wrong. And we forget all the things that are right.
Sure.
And we forget that in comparison with many other empires that had less power than America's had, America could have done much worse things, and it did not do it. Because I think, actually, because of its Christian heritage, by the way, the influence of the church, compassion and love, and so on and so forth, that's what held back a lot of the cruelty that could have taken place. So I do think that there is a certain level of legitimacy, which we need to admit is in that term. There were things that have been lost. When I look at America now, the greatest purveyor of pornography in the world, the immorality, the decay, the use of law to entrench immorality, I do think that there is a difference between this America that we're living in and another America. So in that sense, I think we need to, nuance our indignation at the use, even though as we recognize that, yes, it is sometimes a cover-up for, hey, let's get back to the white dominance, and, all that stuff. I understand that. But I think we also need to understand that, that there's an element of truth in that term that we need to include in there and, respect.
I would agree.
That's just one thing.
I'm grateful to have been born in this country. I've traveled all over the world, and I'm always glad to come home. There are many places I love to go, but there is something wonderful about this country, and it has to do with its Christian heritage. It also has to do with our system of government. It has to do with the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men, and that today,
that's the issue, right?
We'll come to that. Are created equal. Now there was a huge problem.
But that's what I say.
It's got many layers.
And I'm reading this as a white
complex.
Man. It was Thomas Jefferson who was a slaveholder.
Yeah.
So you're thinking, when was America great?
Yeah.
I'd say it was
never perfect.
It was never perfect. I mean, the history of the world is a history of conflict and war.
Yeah.
But it's also, as believers, it's a history of God's unfolding purposes.
Yeah.
So what is God trying to do? And so we're studying history, also trying to discern the work of the Spirit. And so there are ideals that are great ideals. And there are conditions that create great moments in history. And so what Tom Brokaw wrote of in terms of the greatest generation, that didn't just happen. I mean, those people had generations that in a sense shaped them. So there are things that I really appreciate about our country and I love about our country. But I had an experience, let me just share briefly, that as a young missionary, having been in Japan for 7 years, I was at an international conference in Singapore, and I met a young man from Sri Lanka, same age. And he was doing leadership training down in the Philippines as a cross-cultural missionary. I'm doing leadership training in Japan as a cross-cultural missionary. As we're meeting at this Lausanne conference 30 years ago this spring, 30 years ago next month, as he was telling me about the program, the vision for what they were doing in the Philippines, he said, "Are there any young men in Japan that you know who might want to come and study with us?" And as a polite person, I said, "That sounds great. Let me think about it." But in the back of my mind, I was thinking, why would a Japanese person want to go to the Philippines to study with a Sri Lankan when he can stay in his own country and work with an American? Now, the subtext is, I'm better than you. Mm-hmm. Japan's rich, America's rich, you're poor, they're poor. We must be better than you. Mm-hmm. Well, when that thought, which we would call ethnocentrism, when that subconscious thought became conscious, now I'm responsible for it because I realize this is pride. Now, I followed this man. His name is Kumar Abraham. We've been friends now for 30 years. I'm amazed at what God has done in his life. And it seems to me that God does his best work in the most difficult places. And so when I'm with people who come from oppressive backgrounds or hardship areas, I realize oftentimes I have not been developed and made battle ready because my life has been too easy. Well, what am I saying here is it was an encounter with the other person that brought out some of my own prejudices, some of my own biases that made me aware of them. That's when I have to be honest with them. And I remember going back to, we were staying at the University of Singapore, I went back to my room and I knelt by my bed, it was in the middle of the afternoon, and wept and asked God to forgive me of this pride. And so I think that here's a matter of, I want the church in this country to be generous and to be faithful and to be authentic and to be a source of encouragement to the body of Christ around the world.
I mean, the challenge of America being great, and you both have framed this really well in terms of your own perspectives, your own vision. I think America is an experiment. I think it's an experiment that's a conflation of this experiment of what it means to be a representative democracy, which we haven't figured out yet, right? And so it's not an absolute, right? And then this notion of capitalism, which we haven't figured out either. And so there are all these experiments going on. And I think the beauty of experiments is you have trial and error. The unfortunate part of experiments is that when you have errors, people get hurt. And we have a sense of not being compassionate.
Generations
about,
get hurt.
Yeah,
the
generations,
Black American experience.
And so when we look at World War II, it's really easy to talk about the Great Generation and those individuals. But then we don't talk about the Tuskegee Airmen and the syphilis experiment, right? And there's all these tensions there. And for us to frame it always by the good part of it essentially hurts.
It's an oversimplification, and it's very convenient.
Yeah, and so I think the challenge is, how can we be honest and be sincere about the holistic piece from the whole country's perspective? That's the great challenge of whether America is great or good or whatever terminology you want to use. It has to be about America and not just our sliver of the pie and our lens and our perspective of it. The question is America great? Not is your experience in America great? Those are two different questions.
And that's what I think we need to, and I go back to what you said about the Christ and so on, and force ourselves to adopt a 10,000 foot view of the land, as opposed to being so immersed in our own drama as a black person, as a Latino, or as a white, more progressive thinking evangelical, and try to all of a sudden zoom out to another level and see things from a much wider perspective, and to see the complexity of things. Because, for example, again, as a Christian, as a pastor, as a person who thinks theologically and pastorally, as a Latino, as a Pentecostal, I try to bring all these different aspects of my experience into play as I consider all these issues of Trumpism or America's place in the world, or my own Latino experience or the experiences of my parishioners and how I push them to go to another level of progress and functionality. So I deal with that many times. For example, in our own church right now, I recently forced, in a way, I think lovingly and appropriately, our Latino church to give up one of its two main services in the main sanctuary that they spend millions of dollars, of money, giving money to build this beautiful sanctuary, And all of a sudden, I come here and I say, you know what? God has not called the Congregation Lion of Judah to be just a Latino church. We have this English ministry that is meeting separately. And I think for us to be able to affect our city and our culture more, we need to expand our English ministry and give it a bigger place and a bigger space. So I'm asking you to give up one of these two precious services and to make yourselves very uncomfortable by pushing ourselves into one service at noon, which is what we have now for the Latino service, and opening up the first service in the main sanctuary to an English service.
And so-
And you know, why do I do this? Because you know, I get pushpush,
Of course.
from Latinos saying, hey, you know, we've labored for this thing, and now you're taking away. They didn't say it in those, you know, the strong terms, but I think the feeling was
But part
you're
of-
taking away. But I see it as a way, really, of pushing this Latino congregation into another level of influence, of experience as they come into contact with white business people and, you know, young Latino corporate executives, and also those people are also impacted by undocumented immigrants and poor, illiterate old ladies with powerful spirituality, sacrificial giving and serving. And these two groups come together and they mutually reinforce and strengthen each other and push each other forward.